On June 18, 2015, a 36-year-old man from Japan finished the hardest part of his hike, or so it must have felt in the moment. He had made it all the way down the Bright Angel Trail to the Colorado River. He was on his way back up past a stretch of trail called the Devil's Corkscrew when he collapsed. By the time a ranger reached him, he had been without a pulse for about 2 hours. The trail temperature that day was over 110 degrees. The National Weather Service had an excessive heat warning in effect at the time. Nobody ignored a sign that day. Nobody wandered off the marked path looking for a better view. He did the exact thing roughly 5 million people do at this park every single year, on a trail that is paved, signed, and stocked with water stations for that specific purpose. This channel exists to explain why places like this produce the same outcome year after year, using the actual record instead of the campfire version. If that's useful to you, subscribe. By the end of this video, you will know what is actually killing people on this trail. It is almost never the thing they were afraid of when they started walking. Here is the scale of it. About 4.9 million people entered Grand Canyon National Park in 2024, the most since before the pandemic. Inside that population, park sources cite somewhere between roughly 12 and 17 deaths a year, depending on which stretch of years you look at. That is not a spike. That is a baseline, the number the park has learned to expect, the way a city expects a certain number of car accidents every winter. The National Park Service's own mortality data set, tracked since 2007, recorded 216 deaths in the park through the middle of 2024. Of those, 48 happened during hikes, and 23 were tied to swimming or boating. Zoom out further and the number gets larger still. The definitive fatality history of this park, a book called Over the Edge, Death in Grand Canyon, documented 550 deaths across its cataloged span, and later ongoing tracking by its authors pushed that count toward roughly 800, not counting suicides. Whichever total you land on, the shape underneath it does not change. This is not a place that occasionally kills someone. It is a place that reliably does, on a schedule you could almost set a calendar by. Narrow in on the trail itself, and one number does the most damage to your assumptions. Between 2007 and 2025, falls killed about 2.7 people a year here. The odds of any single visitor dying from a fall off the rim have been estimated at roughly 1 in 1.8 million. On its own, that sounds close to nothing. But run 1 in 1.8 million through 4.9 million visits a year, and you stop looking at a freak accident. You're looking at a quiet, dependable certainty. Most years, somebody is going to be that number, and the park does not treat it as news when they are. Meanwhile, Grand Canyon's own emergency medical providers treat more than 1,100 visitors a year for something serious enough to need care in the field. That is not a rounding error attached to a scenic hike. That is a full-time medical operation running underneath the postcard, staffed and staged specifically because the park already knows, before the season even starts, that it will be needed. That's the part that should bother you. This isn't bad luck arriving at random intervals. It's a system quietly producing the same body count on schedule out of the same handful of causes at the same time every summer to a fairly predictable set of people. Nobody at the park treats these numbers as breaking news anymore. They are simply the cost of welcoming almost 5 million strangers a year into a landscape that has never once adjusted itself to accommodate them. Which raises the obvious question. If falling off the edge isn't rare enough to explain that count, and it clearly isn't once you run the math, what is actually filling out the rest of it every single year, without fail, on schedule? Here's the thing. The Bright Angel Trail was built to feel safe, and in a lot of ways it is. It's paved near the trailhead. It has rest houses, seasonal water stations, and toilets spaced along the descent. It is one of the most maintained, heavily used trails inside any national park in the country. That is exactly what makes it dangerous. Think about what your brain does the moment it sees infrastructure like that. Pavement under your feet, signage at every junction, families with strollers walking the same path you are. Your brain runs a quiet calculation and concludes this must be fine. Nobody paves the way to something lethal, surely. Except the infrastructure here was never built to protect you from the canyon's actual hazard. It was built to move you down efficiently. Getting down was never the hard part, and the trail's design reflects that, not the reverse. Getting down is easy, and that ease is the trap built into the geography itself. Gravity does the work for you on the way in. The air at the rim feels cool, sometimes 20 degrees cooler than conditions waiting at the bottom, so your body receives no early warning of what it's actually descending into. And the canyon floor works against you in a way you cannot see or feel coming from above. The inner gorge is lined with dark, dense rock that behaves like an oven, and surface temperatures down there can run 20 to 30 degrees hotter than the number your weather app is quietly telling you at the rim. So you go down, spending your energy, your water, and your margin for error on the one section of the hike that costs you the least. You arrive at the bottom having paid almost nothing for the privilege. The bill comes due on the way back, uphill, in the hottest hours of the day, at exactly the moment you are already tired and already behind schedule. That is the shape of this place. It lets you in for free. It charges you on the way out. You feel strong walking down. That feeling is the trail lying to you, and it knows you won't notice until it's too late to matter, because by then you're the one supplying the effort, not the geography. Every rest house you pass on the descent, every water station still stocked for the season, tells you the same reassuring lie. Someone is looking out for you here. Someone is. But the infrastructure exists to move you efficiently into the hottest, most physically demanding part of the hike, not to protect you once you're standing in it. You built confidence on the way down. You're going to need something closer to caution on the way back, and by the time you realize that, you're already the one carrying it. Every tourist standing at that rim is afraid of the same thing. The edge. The fall. It's the image the mind reaches for first, the one that makes your stomach drop just from looking at the drop itself. Here's what the data actually says. On this trail, the leading killer is not the edge. It is what happens to your body on the climb back up, in the heat, after the descent has already spent you. A park search and rescue coordinator has stated plainly that the most common cause of death here is cardiac arrest. Other reporting on the fatality record describes the same underlying chain: dehydration and heat working together until the heart simply gives out under the load. Here's what almost nobody accounts for. Heat exhaustion isn't just discomfort. It is a documented medical event with a specific mechanism behind it. As your core temperature climbs, your body diverts blood to your skin to shed that heat at the exact moment your leg muscles on that climb are demanding blood too. Push that conflict far enough and you cross into exertional heat stroke, clinically defined by a core temperature above roughly 105 degrees combined with dysfunction in your own central nervous system. People rarely die simply from being hot. They die because that heat sets off a cascade. Clotting problems, kidney failure from muscle breakdown, organ systems failing together instead of one at a time, in sequence, like dominoes that were never separate to begin with. So the trail didn't kill that hiker in 2015 with one dramatic event. It used the ordinary machinery of exertion and heat, running a little too long, a little too far past the point his own body could still recover from on its own. No single decision he made stands out as reckless in the record. That's not a gap in the reporting. That's the entire point. This isn't a mechanism that requires a mistake you'd notice yourself making. It requires only ordinary effort in an environment that quietly changes the math of what ordinary effort costs. That's the reveal this whole video is built around. The fall is the fear you carry with you to the rim. The climb is the thing that actually gets people, quietly, on a schedule, without ever needing you to do anything you'd recognize as wrong. Now walk the causes in order, because the ranking itself tells a story the fear does not. Heat and dehydration sit at the top, and they are the busiest cause of trouble on this trail by a wide margin. Once canyon temperatures cross about 95 degrees, calls for hiker assistance rise sharply, roughly 60% according to park data. A peer-reviewed study of the park's own rescue operations found the same threshold effect independently, using its own separate data set. The mechanism is the one you just heard. Blood diverted to the skin, muscles starved of it in return, core temperature climbing past what your body can shed on its own until confusion and organ failure take over from there. You can see this exact pattern already in the record. In 2015, that hiker near the Devil's Corkscrew was doing precisely what the trail is built for. Walking back up after reaching the river in triple-digit heat under an active excessive heat warning that had already been issued that day. He is not an outlier in this story, and the record does not treat him as one. He is the shape of what this trail does on an ordinary bad day to an ordinary hiker who did nothing unusual to deserve it. The location matters too. That stretch of trail sits in the lower half of the corridor, close enough to the river that the descent already feels finished, and far enough from the rim that help is never close. Just below Heat sits something that rarely makes a headline: cardiac arrest, triggered by exertion. The climb out is sustained, maximal effort, and when it's stacked on top of dehydration and heat, it raises heart rate and thickens the blood at precisely the worst moment to do either. Middle-aged and older hikers, carrying coronary disease they may not know they have, are the ones most exposed to that particular stack. A heart that gives out on a trail typically gets written up as natural causes. It rarely gets written up as a canyon statistic, even though the canyon is what pushed it there in the first place. That's exactly why this cause stays underestimated year after year. It doesn't look like the environment's fault on paper. It is the environment's fault. Nobody warns you about your own cardiovascular history before you buy a trail map, and the trail has no way of knowing what it's asking of a heart it's never met. Here's where it gets worse, because this next cause inverts the entire warning system you thought you understood. Hyponatremia is what happens when a hiker drinks large amounts of water without replacing salt, and their blood sodium drops to dangerous levels as a result. The symptoms look almost identical to heat exhaustion, so hikers respond exactly the way they've been trained to respond. They drink more water. That makes it worse, not better. Cells swell, including in the brain, and a person who genuinely believes they did everything right, who stayed hydrated, who followed the advice on every sign they passed on the way down, can go down anyway. This is the twist inside the twist. Even obeying the warning correctly can fail you here if you obey only the first half of it and never learn there was a second half waiting. Every sign along this trail tells you to drink water. None of them, standing alone, tell you that water without salt can turn against you just as fast as no water at all. Now finally, the one everyone came here afraid of. Falls. Between 2007 and 2025, they killed about 2.7 people a year on average, and men die from falls at nearly twice the rate women do. Across the canyon's entire recorded history, one accounting puts fatal falls at 125 total, split almost evenly, 64 from the rim itself and 61 within the canyon below it. It is real. People genuinely do lose their footing near unfenced edges, usually while photographing the view or wandering off the marked trail to get a better angle for the photo. But it is not the dominant killer on this corridor, and it has not been for years running. It is simply the most cinematic cause, the one your imagination reaches for automatically the moment you stand at the rim and look down. And that is exactly why it crowds out everything quieter and more common happening on the trail beneath your feet, out of sight in slow motion. The edge earns the fear. The climb earns the death toll. Those have never been the same thing here, and the gap between them is most of what this video exists to close. Two causes remain, and they matter less to a day hiker on this specific trail, but they round out the full picture of the canyon as a whole. Flash floods and drownings, mostly tied to swimming and boating on the Colorado River, account for a real share of the park's total deaths, but they belong mostly to the river corridor, not to the rim-to-river hiking trail you'd actually be walking on foot. And historically, the single deadliest category at this canyon overall wasn't a hiking hazard at all. It was aviation. Sightseeing plane and helicopter crashes killed roughly 275 people here across the decades, including 128 in a single 1956 mid-air collision, at the time the deadliest commercial air disaster in the country. That number matters because it proves a point this entire video rests on. The deadliest thing at the Grand Canyon and the deadliest thing on this specific trail are two different questions, with two completely different answers. If you've ever pushed past a point where you probably should have turned around because you felt fine in the moment, tell me in the comments below. And if this is making you reconsider a hike you already had planned, that's worth a like because the part most people get wrong is still coming. None of these causes work alone. That's the part I keep coming back to. Heat doesn't just make you uncomfortable, it degrades the exact judgment you would need to notice you're in trouble in the first place. Dehydration doesn't just make you thirsty, it sets up the cardiac event waiting quietly underneath it. Hyponatremia doesn't announce itself as a mistake at all. It disguises itself as the correct, responsible response. The trail doesn't kill with one big dramatic thing. It strips away your margin for error in small increments, invisible ones, until an ordinary mistake, a slightly late turnaround, a slightly underfilled water bottle, becomes fatal entirely on its own without any single moment you could point to and call the cause. That's the lens worth holding on to for the rest of this video. It lets you in for free and it charges you on the way out, and the currency it charges in is your own body's remaining ability to recover from what it's already spent. Here is where it turns personal, because the thing that's supposed to warn you is the first thing this place disables. Heat exhaustion produces headache, dizziness, and confusion as a direct, documented symptom before it ever becomes anything more severe than that. That means the organ responsible for telling you to stop is the organ currently being cooked. You don't get a clean warning down here. You get a degraded one, arriving through a brain that is already compromised by the exact thing it's supposed to be warning you about in the first place. It is not that people ignore the warning signs on this trail. It's that by the time the signs would matter most, the part of them built to receive a warning is already the part failing. Then there's the mind of the person who is fit enough to make things worse instead of better. Research on heat illness risk has found that motivation can push people to override their own body's signals, working closer to real exhaustion than a less driven person ever would allow themselves to get. If you're strong, if you've run marathons, if you've hiked harder trails before without incident, none of that history protects you here. It can actually do the opposite. It teaches you to distrust your own warning signs right up until the moment they're the only thing left telling you the truth about your own condition. On July 8, 2004, a University of Chicago medical student named Margaret Bradley set out on a summer day run from a South Rim trailhead into the canyon. She had placed 15th in that year's Boston Marathon. She and her running partner became separated during the effort, and she was later found by Park Search and Rescue. Over the Edge co-author Dr. Tom Myers has discussed her death as a heat fatality. She was, by any reasonable measure, one of the most physically capable people to walk into that canyon that summer. That's the part I can't get past. Fitness is not armor down here. In some ways, it functions as a longer leash, one that lets you walk further past the point where a less capable person would already have turned back on their own. Layer onto that the sunk cost baked into the descent itself. Park rangers, through the Preventive Search and Rescue program, spend their time on the trail asking hikers how far they're going and how much water they're carrying, specifically because turning around after you've already spent the effort to get where you are feels like admitting failure out loud. Your brain would rather finish the hike than accept that it made a bad call an hour ago, back on the way down, when turning around would have cost almost nothing at all. The National Park Service itself has repeatedly warned visitors not to attempt the full round trip from the rim to the river and back in a single day. That warning exists precisely because it is so often ignored, not because it is obscure or hard to find. It's posted at the trailhead. Most people who die out there walk past it on their way in. That instinct to push through anyway, useful in almost every other part of your life, is the one that gets people killed in this particular canyon. It is the same instinct that finishes a marathon on a bad ankle or pushes through a difficult meeting instead of walking out. Down here, it just meets a consequence your other environments never bothered to attach to it. And here is the part that raises the stakes on everything you just heard. Help is not close. A hiker in distress here is often thousands of feet below the rim, reachable only on foot or by helicopter in terrain that resists both. For years, rangers operated in a reactive posture, staging at the south rim and scrambling to find someone available to send down the trail only after a distress call had already come in from below. The park's own numbers show the scale of that ongoing effort. Preventive search and rescue teams perform roughly 750 hiker assists and about 300 full search and rescue missions every single year. That level of demand is not cheap. In the late 1990s, these operations were already costing taxpayers about $1 million a year. In 2014 alone, the park logged 324 operations at a cost of about $500,000, and officials said most of those specific calls were for fatigue, inexperience, and simple physical inability, not for accidents or falls off the trail. The park absorbs the cost of cheaper rescues on its own operating budget. The expensive ones, the helicopter ones, draw instead on a national pool of taxpayer money set aside for exactly this. and the demand for all of it is heat-gated in a very specific, predictable way. Rescue calls climb sharply once canyon temperatures cross 95 degrees, which means the rescues cluster at exactly the moment the terrain is least survivable and the aircraft are hardest to fly safely into it. The system scales with the danger instead of ahead of it, because there is no way to stage a helicopter at the bottom of a 9-mile trail before someone is already on it. The danger down there does not pause while a helicopter gets airborne and finds its way to you. It keeps working, quietly, the entire time help is still on its way. That 2-hour window near the Devil's Corkscrew wasn't a failure of the rescue system. It was the rescue system working roughly as it always does, arriving as fast as geography allows into terrain that was never designed to make speed possible in the first place. So who actually dies here? Not who you'd guess standing at the rim. In 2014, the park reported that most search and rescue calls involved men over 50, and that the driving factors were fatigue, inexperience, and physical inability, not recklessness of any kind. A separate study of rim-to-rim day hikers found a median age of 43, 65% male, with body mass indices that skewed toward overweight, especially among the men, attempting an effort that researchers compared directly to running a trail marathon or an ultramarathon on foot. These are not the people you picture when you picture a Grand Canyon tragedy. They are not unprepared teenagers ignoring a posted sign at the trailhead. They are overwhelmingly capable adults who trained beforehand, who planned their route in advance, who felt genuinely ready walking to the trailhead that morning, and who were simply slightly wrong about where their actual limit sat that day. The record behind this video keeps returning to the same uncomfortable line. These are people who overestimated themselves by a small margin, inside an environment engineered specifically to punish small margins and nothing else. If you've stood at that rim and felt confident because you run, because you hike, because you've done harder things on paper than this trail, that confidence is the profile this video has been describing the whole time. That's not an insult aimed at you personally. It's a pattern documented in the record, over and over, in the exact people it keeps quietly catching. None of this requires you to be careless. It only requires you to be an averagely fit adult who trusted a paved trail, a filled water bottle, and a plan that felt reasonable at 8 in the morning. By 1 in the afternoon, at the bottom of the canyon, in heat you couldn't fully anticipate from the rim, that same reasonable plan can turn into exactly the kind of margin this environment was built to erase. Nothing about that morning would have looked like a warning sign to anyone standing next to you. The canyon isn't hunting anyone. It doesn't need to. It just keeps doing exactly what it has always done, year after year, regardless of who happens to be walking through it. It lets you in for free and it charges you on the way out, in heat and exertion and a body that runs out of margin before you ever notice it's gone. It was doing this before this video existed, and it will keep doing it after you close the tab, indifferent to whether anyone is watching or explaining it at all. The fact I keep coming back to is the 2-hour window, the length of time that hiker near the Devil's Corkscrew spent without a pulse before anyone reached him. Not because it's the goriest detail in this video, because it's the plainest proof that the danger never paused to wait for help to arrive, and it never will for anyone on any given ordinary day on a trail that looks, at 8 in the morning, like the easiest hike in the park. So tell me which of these actually surprised you. The hyponatremia, the cardiac risk, or the fact that falling barely makes the list at all once you look at the numbers honestly. And tell me which place you want this channel to take apart next. If you want the real numbers behind why these places keep killing people and not the campfire version, subscribe.